Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our final week of our Christian ethics course. It's great that you've been here for the long haul and that you're still here, so I take that as an encouraging thing. My name's Stephen Liggins, which I trust you know by now, and I'm sure you know that.
And I'm Justine.
Yeah, there we go. Now, once again, I hope you've got a drink, you're comfortable, you've printed off the handout for this week, and you're ready to go. But I thought right here at the start, I just wanted to say thank you to a few people. Firstly, thank you to you for watching. It's been very encouraging to know that there are people who are interested in thinking through these issues. Also, thank you to Justine, who has very kindly agreed to be part of this as well. And tonight she'll actually be presenting one of the topics on the environment, and she'll be on the Zoom afterwards tonight if you'd like to discuss things with her further. And I'd also like to give a big thank you to our tech team. They know who they are for all their hard work with this, and so we really appreciate them. Now let me just remind you where we've been in the course so far. We introduced ethics as a general topic. We said we were doing normative evangelical Christian ethics for the majority of these seminars. Then we looked at using the Bible in ethics, and we said we need to treat the Bible as, authoritative, unified, progressive and gospel focused, and we interpret it using exegesis, biblical theology and systematic theology. We saw thirdly in week 3 that the Bible through ethical teaching is unified. It's based on loving God and loving your neighbour, which should produce a whole framework of mutual love relationships, as we saw a couple of weeks ago. And then last week we started to look at ethical teaching in the Bible. Firstly, we looked at an example of ethical passages and how to go about looking at an ethical passage. And then we looked at our first ethical issue, and we saw how to go about looking at an ethical issue. Now, I was aware last week that we really didn't have much time to get into warfare in any real depth. It was really just, showing you how the methodology could work. Hopefully tonight we'll have a bit more time to go into one of our issues at least, the environment, which Justine will be presenting shortly. Don't forget, there's the Moore College PTC course, Christian Ethics, and Michael Hill's book, The How and Why of Love, which is very helpful, which I recommend to you should you like to look into these things earlier. Another book which I could mention is that John Stott wrote a very good book, which has been updated a few times, called Issues Facing Christians Today. And in that book he addresses many ethical issues in the modern context in a very detailed and helpful way. I recommend that book, Issues Facing Christians Today by John Stott. Now just a few comments I'd just like to make at the start tonight about using what we've learned. If you've learned anything from this course, I guess we want to use it. We want to actually believe the things and live it out and have our character change. This is not supposed to be just a stimulating academic exercise. Hopefully it's that as well. But we want to live lives which are more like Christ, which are more consistent with loving God and loving our neighbour. I believe that Christian ethical living is liberating because we're living the way we were created to live. But of course it will on occasions attract opposition, and there are certain ethical issues which Christians have views on which are sometimes at odds with the way our culture thinks. I also would like to emphasise that really evangelism and discipleship and fellowship are some of the key things or key aspects of Christian ethical living, so we need to remember that. And also as we're working at our Christian lives, we work but God works through us. And I've got a passage down there from Philippians chapter 2 which says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and act in order to fulfill his good purpose." So it's basically saying that, we work it out, but God is working through us. We work, but God gives us the strength and God changes us. Just a few thoughts. So as I said, the main ethical issue tonight is the environment, and I'm handing over to Justine.
Okay. Well, I think that in regards to ethical issues facing our world, that this is an important one. There are lots of important ones, but this one I think we see people discussing globally and locally around us. I was wondering, I've never chatted to you, Stephen, about the environment or what you think about it, but do you think it's an important issue?
Yeah, I do. I think it's very important, and I think I should think about it more. But it seems to me that this world is God's world, which He's given us, and that we should look after it in a responsible way. If my brother lent me his car, I would drive it being aware that it's not my car, it's his. I need to look after it properly.
Yeah.
And so I guess as a general principle, I want to know what it means to look after God's world well. And there are lots of areas where we think we probably aren't. And there's questions of global warming and plastics in the ocean, and nuclear power, is that good or bad? And all sorts of issues. Like reduced biodiversity. I like watching David Attenborough nature documentaries, and I'm reading a book of his at the moment, and he talks about, I think, the reduction in the biodiversity in the world and the consequences that can have. So it's clearly, I think it's an important issue.
Yeah, and you touched on a few things that we'll look at as well, on the idea of stewardship of God's world and looking after what we've been given. There are lots of reasons that I think it's an important issue for us at the moment. I think we're starting to see some of the impact of changes in temperature, or at least that's what scientists are telling us. Longer droughts, intense bushfires, and a lot of the deadlines that we spoke about decades ago, they're getting close. 2030 was a big one, 2050, and they're getting closer. Australia is not very popular on the global stage for our approach to climate change. And Australians can become quite defensive about that. But I also think we have a relational issue going on. Younger people feel that older people have messed up the world and don't care about it. And a lot of our younger people are afraid of the future. They're worried. They even have a sense of despair. Not everybody, but there's a sense of despair that the problem is too big and we can't fix what we've done. Some young people, I've heard them talk about how older people don't care for them, won't listen and won't change their behaviour, and they're not inheriting the world, that we're passing on something and we just don't care about our young people. So I think the environment as an ethical issue is actually important to us relationally, and it's dividing us. I also think it divides us in regards to wealth and poverty, and whether we think that caring about the environment is actually perhaps a justice issue, where if predictions are correct, the impact of climate change will be felt most strongly by poorer nations, either because they live in zones where their climate will become more unstable, or perhaps because they can't economically protect themselves from some of the changes the way we can, like larger floods or more severe droughts. And so perhaps we need to think about the environment as a justice issue in the world, that we're not caring for people who are poorer. Stephen, do you have any thoughts about some of the questions that Christians might have about the environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably most Christians would accept the fact that we need to be good stewards of the world. But I think a lot of the tricky things come up with what does that look like in practice? Yeah. So you've got often decisions where if we can't rely on renewable energies yet, is it better to rely on coal-powered power stations, or should we be using nuclear power stations? If you do nuclear power stations, is that too dangerous, like Fukushima? So I find that a lot of environmental issues, I feel that we know what we want to do at a big picture, but how we get there is sometimes a bit less straightforward. At least that's how I feel.
Yeah. I think there are some reasons why perhaps some of us don't care about the environment very much as well, as Christians or just as, others.
Yep. I mean, some Christians might think, that's all going to end anyway, who cares?
Yeah, that's right. And so that actually would be like a materialist kind of view, right? So the world is there to be consumed.
Yep.
So why not consume it?
Yep.
And then there might also be, some Christians might have the idea that the physical doesn't matter.
Yep.
That it's passing away.
Sounding very Gnostic almost.
Yeah. So it doesn't matter. Only spiritual things matter, and that's not a spiritual thing.
Yeah.
And some people, there is that that way of speaking and thinking in the world that's kind of pagan, it is pagan, where we have Mother Nature, and where the environment is seen as a god, and and that kind of thing. And perhaps as Christians, we want to really distance ourselves from that kind of thing. And so we've swung a lot further away. And so we don't care about the environment because we don't want to be like those people.
Yes.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to apply the framework that we've been looking at to the environment. And so as an ethical issue. So the first step that we looked at last week is that you identify the passages that are relevant to this ethical issue. So in your handout, there's a whole bunch of passages, and it would be great if you went through each of them. We won't read out each of them. So that's our first step. So identify the passages that are relevant to the ethical issue that you want to think about. And then the second step is that you want to place these passages into the structure that we had. So creation, fall, Old Testament, covenant, new Jesus, and the new creation. So where do our passages fit into that framework? So that's where we're going to start. So Stephen, could you read for us Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 28?
So Genesis 1, verses 26 to 28. Okay. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground."
Thank you. So we're putting our passages into the framework, and we're starting with creation. So God made the world. He made everything in the world, and it was good. And he made humans in his image as rulers over the world under him. So we were to rule the world, and it was all of the world, wasn't it? It was the fish in the sea, the animals on the land, the whole world.
Yep.
Under him. What about, could you read Genesis 2, verse 15?
Yeah, Genesis 2:15 says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it."
So we have a purpose, which is to work the land and look after it. So we're stewards, caring for something, but we're also actively working it. Like we're using it. We're allowed to change it. We're allowed to work it and make it into things. What about Genesis 3:17?
Yeah, so we're in the fall section now. So 3:17. Do you want me to go to
19?
19?
Please.
Yeah. Okay. To Adam he said, "Because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. From dust you are, and to dust you will return."
So we've come from creation where God made the world, it was good, he made everything in the world. He made different things with different kinds, with different purposes. Humans were made in his image to rule the world, but then sin entered the world. And now we see that the ground was cursed. And sin disrupted and fractured the relationship of humans and the land, humans and their environment. It's now our ability to rule it and our ability to work the land has been disrupted by sin. In Romans 8, we see that creation is now subjected to futility. And also from the fall, we know that sin has entered humans too. So whilst we're still made in God's image, we've become self-centered. We've become greedy. We've become idolatrous. And so that has impacted our relationship with God, our relationship with other people, but also our relationship with creation. So sin has come into the world and has damaged those relationships. So let's look at what the Bible has to say about the environment for Israel in the Old Covenant. So could you read for me, Stephen, Psalm 147,
Yes.
verse 7 to 9?
Psalm 147, starting at verse 7. Sing to the Lord with grateful praise. Make music to our God on the harp. He covers the sky with clouds. He supplies the earth with rain and makes grass grow on the hills. He provides food for the cattle and for the young ravens when they call.
So we see that God is a God who cares for and is in control of the environment. He looks after his creation. What about Proverbs 12, verse 10?
Proverbs 12, verse 10. The righteous care for the needs of their animals, but the kindest acts of the wicked are cruel.
I find that proverb to be really just surprising that it's there, but it's a reminder that actually the righteous will care for their animals.
We need to look after our cats and dogs.
We need to look after our cats and dogs. God actually wants us to look after animals. They're important. And it's part of that going back to what we were meant to do as humans. We were meant to rule as he rules and look after creation as he looks after creation and his, animals. In Exodus 23, it talks about, verse 10 to 11, it talks about leaving the land fallow to rest. It talks about letting the land rest, but also so that the poor can come along and use it and get things from it. And after the poor have used the land, then animals can use the land. And it's that idea of stewardship. Let the land rest. We're not materialists, and we're not there to strip away every resource for our own gain. We're to leave some for others coming after us, particularly the poor. And then another chapter is Job, chapter 38 to 40, where the purpose is God is wanting to talk to Job and say, this is who I am, I'm God. But what we see is a God who sees everything in his world. He sees the mountain goat giving birth. He sees animals that we didn't know were there, that he created in detail. He cares for his creation. He knows it and he sees it. And not just initially like a set and forget, but intimately. He sees the animals giving birth. He knows where they live. He provides for them. That's God's relationship to his creation. So now we might look at Jesus in our framework. What passages talk about the environment or our relationship in terms of Jesus and the new covenant? So I thought maybe, could you please read, Stephen, Colossians 1, 16 to 20.
Colossians chapter 1, 16 to 20. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross.
So we know that Jesus has rescued us from our sin. We know that, and he's restored us and reconciled us to himself. But we also see in that passage that Jesus' death has reconciled all things, which includes creation. God sustains all things. He holds all things together. And so what we saw of God in the Old Testament, we see of God in the New Testament, but we see that God has restored it. What got broken in the fall, our creation, our relationship with each other, with God, with the world, is reconciled all things. We also know that having been rescued from our sin and restored to Him, we're being made in His likeness. We're being renewed and changed to be, to rule like Him, but to be like Him, to be His child and to be like Him. And we know that the kingdom has become our priority. So we're not materialists who are storing up treasure on earth. The kingdom is our priority. So we're not the dualists who think that physical things don't matter, because we can see that the world and creation does matter to God. But we're not materialists who are only about consuming and getting, because we live for the kingdom, which is coming. Which leads actually straight to Revelation, which you don't need to read, but I mean you can actually. Would you like to read Revelation?
I want what you want.
Okay, Revelation 22, 1 to 3.
Okay, Revelation 22, 1 to 3. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and His servants will serve Him.
I mean, it's a beautiful image of the new creation, no longer cursed, but full of life. Restored, reconciled, in good relationship, and there's harmony again between God and man and between humanity and creation. So that's our step 2, where we've taken the passages and we've put them into our framework, our biblical theology, the story of what's happening. And now our step 3 is to then go, well, how does that apply? How do we, what are the conclusions to our questions that we can get from that? So here are some of my ideas, and you might have some more ideas.
Okay,
Here are some of mine. So we submit to Jesus as our King, and He restores us to our rightful place as God's image bearers who rule the world under Him. We put off the old self of greed and selfishness, and we put on the new self of love and service. And we're to love, which we've looked at from other weeks, we're to love our neighbour. And I think loving our neighbour also means that we love our children, and our children and our young people are expressing to us that they're worried about the environment and that they feel that some of us older people are not listening or caring. Now we need to love them. We need to love them. They are our neighbour, and we need to listen to their concerns and actually, love them. But we also need to love our global poorer neighbour, our local neighbour, but also our global neighbour. So I think that's the part of the putting off our old self of selfishness and greed and putting on the new self of love and service, where we're motivated by that mutual love that we've been speaking about. We know that the kingdom is our priority and that that's what God is doing in the world. He's saving a people. So we live for something more than the now. So like we said before, we're not materialists storing up treasure, and we're not greedily stripping away all of the resources for our own gain. We care for the land and for animals because land and animals were created by God and loved by God. They are a kind with a purpose, and their purpose is to be enjoyed. Their purpose is to feed us, to shelter us. The purpose of land is to feed animals, to feed and shelter our neighbour. And so we don't just treat the land as a rubbish dump, because that wasn't the purpose for which it was created. It was created with a bigger purpose than that. And so we honour the purpose that God created it for, to be enjoyed, but also to be shared and looked after. So the environment has more purpose than just to be used up and disregarded. But also we trust God. So some of the reason that the environment can be such a hot button issue is that some of us feel threatened that we have to change, or that we're being criticised for perhaps what our generation has done before, or perhaps it's also a hot button issue because there's a lot of fear and a sense of being out of control around the environment and what might be happening. We feel afraid of what we're handing on to our children, what they're going to have to deal with. But we're not driven or ruled by fear or despair, because God sustains and God holds all things together, and He loves and cares for us and His creation. So that's my kind of summary of how we think about the environment according to that framework. So it seems pretty clear to me that we're to look after God's world, that we're not to just use and abuse it, and that we are to love our neighbour by caring for how environmental change affects them, whether it's our young adults or our kids or our neighbours. And so we have a responsibility under God to look after the world that He gave to us. And that means we look after it, not from our own interests, but the interests of others. So that might mean we have to change some of the things that we do. What are your thoughts, Stephen?
Oh, look, many thoughts, but perhaps just one or two, is that I think one thing with the environment is we can actually appreciate the environment. And so if God's given us this incredible creation, it seems to me the appropriate thing to do is to, when we observe it and appreciate it, to thank God for it. And
yes.
One of the things I'm very grateful for, although I don't believe he's a Christian, David Attenborough wildlife documentaries, I love them. And I watch them and think, isn't God's creation incredible?
Yes.
So I think that's one thing we can do. The other thing which strikes me is that I really do think we've got to try and do things which are sustainable for the long term. And so whatever we can do to make sure that we have sustainable power long term which doesn't destroy the environment, I think we've got to genuinely work towards it. And things like that. So I think, not just my children, but, in 100 years' time, what world have we passed over? What can I do to help that? Well, I can pray about it. I guess I can donate to people who are doing work in this area or support them, or I can let my politicians know if I get the chance or if I want to that, I think these are important. So I guess my thing is that appreciate the culture. The environment is God's world, look after it, but also we want to make sure it's there in a sustainable way.
One of the things what we haven't talked about is, the details of what it actually looks like to then care for God's world and care for the environment. And one of the things that I sometimes hear is, well, what difference does my compost bin make? Like, look at the huge problems. What difference does it make if I recycle or if I, choose the green power on my electricity bill? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Just a couple of off-the-cuff ones. I do think every little bit counts in terms of not just impact of the world, but also pleasing God.
Yes.
And I also think, and this is a bit more pragmatic, if in my own really minor and probably inadequate and insufficient ways I try and care for the environment, I may influence some kid to care for the environment who may grow up to become the Prime Minister of Australia and have an incredible impact on the environment. So, you just never quite know how our acts are going to impact things long term. But I think I want to do the right thing because it's pleasing to God.
Yeah, well, that's right, isn't it? Like
I should do more, but yeah.
Well, I think we can get overwhelmed with feeling like there's more we could do, because it is endless. There is more that we could do, but I think we don't really. That doesn't mean you don't do anything, firstly, but also that's not really how to make an ethical decision. You don't make an ethical decision because your decision is going to change the world. You make an ethical decision because you've come to a point where you think that's the right way
thing to do.
So if you've come to a decision where you think, I need to look after God's world and I need to love my neighbour, and part of that is looking after this world that he gave us, and we want to care for the concerns of others, then I'm going to recycle. It doesn't really matter if, in terms of whether I do it or not, if I'm going to make a global impact. But also, of course, it's going to make an impact because we're living God's way.
Yes.
And so as you live as God's people in his world, under his rule, then it's going to make a difference.
Yeah. I mean, that's like that with a lot of things as Christians. We may sponsor a child to get an education. Has that solved the educational problem of that country? No, but it's done something and it's pleasing to God. So I think a lot of things are like that. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So we looked at that one issue in some degree of depth. We've only got about 5 or 10 minutes left. I'm just going to quickly touch upon a few other things, but I want to do one topic properly, which is the environment. Now, singleness, I've got some notes on singleness down there, which I'll let you read through, but I'll just make a few comments, is that there are a lot of personal ethical issues as well, and I do think that one of the issues which is good to think about at the moment is singleness. Justin, have you ever thought about the importance of thinking through singleness as a Christian?
Oh, yeah, I think that both from the position of singleness and marriage, that we need to look after single people. We need to understand singleness as a good choice. And we need to love these people who are single for all the different reasons that you might be single in our church. And I worry sometimes that we have sent that message that to be a grown-up you get married, or to be mature you get married, or all kinds of things. And whilst marriage is wonderful and a good gift, singleness is a good gift too. But I wonder if sometimes we haven't, even if we know that in our head, if that hasn't seeped through to the way we treat people in our church.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I was single till the age of 39, so I've spent well over 2/3 of my life being single. And I'll just highlight what is in the sheets. I think singleness affects everyone. We all start our lives single. If we marry, we may get separated. Our spouse may die before we do. We'll be single again. So singleness is important to everyone. Many people are contentedly single. Some people find singleness a challenge. They either miss their perhaps deceased spouse, or they wish they were married, or being single means it creates difficulties in life and trying to look after your house and your finances and everything else like that. Singleness is on the increase as marriage rates drop, as people marry later, as divorce gets higher. And also, I think sometimes people can be a bit insensitive to others. Sometimes we can be insensitive to single people. What's wrong with you? Marriage isn't everything. You should lower your standards. She died ages ago. Haven't you got it over it yet? All sorts of things like that. Now, we wanted to think through this in depth. I've listed there are passages in the scripture which speak specifically about singleness, and I've listed quite a few down there. We could also look at other passages which deal with related issues, like if someone's not content as single, we could look at what the Bible says about contentedness. If someone thinks that I'm concerned about the kingdom of God, we could look about what the Bible says about the kingdom of God. If we want to think about other issues which relate, we could look at those passages too. But on page 5, I've put down some passages which are relevant to marriage and singleness and things like that. And I'll just highlight a few. That at stage 3 in the Old Testament and the Old Covenant, Exodus describes the lot of the widow as being a vulnerable one. So I guess one of the issues for singleness in the Old Testament was it could make you vulnerable. When we get to the New Testament, one of the passages I'll highlight is Matthew 19, which says, some choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, which I take to mean some people decide to be single on purpose for kingdom of God reasons. And then Paul unpacks this idea in a bit more depth in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where he says that he's happy with his state of being single. It was an advantage to be single in the context to which Paul was writing, he felt. And being single gives you a certain opportunity to focus on the Lord's affairs, or on certain forms of the Lord's affairs, which married people may not be quite as able to do. We also note that there is no marriage in the new creation, although we're sort of married to God in the new creation. Now, there are other passages there as well. I guess when I draw my conclusions about singleness a bit later, I say it's good to be married, it's good to be single. In the New Testament, there are some great examples of single people. Jesus, Paul, they certainly had very productive and profitable lives. That's an understatement of the century. Now, I guess one of the issues is sometimes people are unhappily single because their spouse has passed away and they miss them, or because their marriage broke down, or because they never were married and they wish they were. And so at that point, I think issues of support within the church for people come to play, where for the individual we think about contentment and things like that, and they would be worth pursuing if we had time. But I guess the highlight here is that the Bible teaches that being single is good, being married is good. The key thing is that we're loving and serving God and loving our neighbours, and that's that mutual love ethic again. That's the big thing. Now, assuming, Justine, that's a quick summary of where the Bible might take us, do you think Christians have any problem with that? With the view that it's good to be married, good to be single. The key thing is loving God and loving our neighbour.
I think that probably we say that, and we do say we agree with it, but yeah, like I said, I think that sometimes maybe the way we practically do that, we say that we are sending the message that marriage is better.
Yeah. So we agree with it, but maybe we need to watch what messages we're sending out as well. What do you think our general culture thinks about singleness, like outside of the church?
I think that our culture is a little bit the same, but they're probably much more comfortable with singleness because it doesn't mean abstinence from sex. Whereas for Christians, we're asking single people, or God is asking single people to not have sex. And so I think the world thinks that is crazy.
Yeah.
But then equally, the world will also still say that you need to be in a relationship with somebody in order to live a full life. So.
Yeah. And I guess one of the advantages of the church, if it's working well, is those that we are in relationships with people in the church. We're part of a supportive community. And just for what it's worth, as I said, I didn't get married till I was 39. Most of my friends got married before me. And I really appreciated it, just spending time with my non-married friends and my married friends. And in one sense, it didn't make too much difference to me. They were just people, and they accepted me as I was, which was very nice.
Yeah.
We could say so much more about this, but we won't. I'm about to tie up. I just note that, as you probably figured out, when we thought about warfare last week, when we looked at the environment, a lot of these ethical issues, we can figure out what the biblical principles are, but the tricky thing is applying it to complex situations. And just on the last page there, I raised the question, what about Afghanistan? We're all thinking about that at the moment. Most of us think that what's happening there is a bit of a tragedy. Interestingly, though, the Taliban don't think it's a tragedy, which is what the point I made in the first week about people have different ethical systems, but I think it's a tragedy. So many issues which it raises, freedom of belief, treatment of women, treatment of cultural minorities. Should we interfere in the affairs of another country? If so, how should we exert pressure? What role should the international community play in this? And practically speaking, what can you or I do? Now, one of the great things is there is something which we can always do, no matter how complex the situation is, and that's that we can pray. And that is a really constructive thing that we can do. We can also support groups which we think are doing good work in these sorts of areas, Amnesty International or something like that. If we feel that we have a good grasp of the situation and we can make some constructive suggestions, we can always encourage our government to take certain actions. We might think, let's take in Afghan refugees or something like that. And of course, the best thing, pretty well everything besides prayer, is to engage in evangelism and discipleship, because that will help everything in the end. Now, that's just a real trying to highlight that there are so many issues in some of these things. Now, we're pretty much at the end of our course now, Justine. I think we've come to the conclusion. I hope it's been lovely presenting it with you and with the guys doing the technology up the back. I hope you found it helpful. You probably realise that the things we've discussed have probably only started your thinking. And so I guess the thing to do is, if we're concerned, to pray, to act if we can see an obvious way forward in these areas. If you want to do further reading, I've suggested Hill's book, the PTC course, Issues Facing Christians Today by John Stott. I recommend them to you. If you've enjoyed this course, we may run similar courses in the future, either online or in person. We did biblical theology in the first term. We've done this. We could do courses on doctrine or church history, the sorts of things which are good to know about, but perhaps can't be dealt with in detail in church or small groups. So if you're interested in any of those things, please let me know. We're about to go to Zoom, and this week Justine is going to be with us on Zoom because she was the main presenter this evening, and so both of us will be there to field any of the questions which you may have. So it's been great sharing time with you. I hope you're well. Farewell.
See you soon.